The floorboards gave them away. My own son. My Daniel. His voice a venomous whisper in the house my husband and I built, detailing how he'd steal it all from me. He thought I was just a grieving old woman, deaf to the world. He was wrong. If you've ever felt the sting of betrayal, like this story and subscribe to see Justice Served. The sound was a familiar one, a low groan from the old pine floorboards on the landing, the same sound that used to announce Robert coming to bed after a late night checking on a sick animal. But Robert was gone. 6 months now, buried under the willow tree by the creek. The sound now was furtive, a thief's sound. I froze, my hand hovering over the half-darned sock in my lap, the fire in the hearth casting long, dancing shadows across the living room. It was past midnight. The only other people in this house, this sprawling Vermont farmhouse that held the entire history of my marriage, were my son, Daniel, and his wife, Vanessa. They had arrived a month ago, their car packed to the brim, faces etched with a practiced sympathy. "We're here to help you, Mom," Daniel had said, his arms wrapping around me in a hug that felt hollow, like the shell of a dead tree. "You shouldn't be alone." I wanted to believe him. Lord, how I wanted to. But tonight, that floorboard groaned with a different weight. It wasn't the sound of a son checking on his grieving mother. It was the sound of a secret. I set the sock down, my knuckles white, and crept toward the doorway, staying in the deep shadows cast by the grandfather clock Robert had inherited from his father. Their voices drifted down the staircase, sharp and clear in the heavy silence of the country night. It was Vanessa speaking first, her tone like ice chipping at stone. "Is she asleep?" she hissed. "Did you check?" A pause. Then Daniel. My Daniel. His voice stripped of the warmth I'd known his entire life, now thin and reedy. "She's out. Took her pills like a good little lamb. I swear, she's half gone already, just rattling around this big old house." A bitter laugh followed, a sound so alien it made the hair on my arms stand up. Good little lamb. The phrase coiled in my stomach like a snake. I had been taking chamomile tea for sleep, not pills. It was a small lie, but it was the foundation for a much larger one. Vanessa's voice came again, impatient. "Never mind that. Did the lawyer call back? Is the paperwork ready?" "Tomorrow," Daniel said. He said with the power of attorney she signed. "It's a simple transfer. We just need to get her signature on the new mortgage application. He said it's better if she signs it herself, less chance of it being contested later." Power of attorney? I had signed something. Yes. Daniel had pushed it in front of me a few weeks ago, mumbling something about it being easier to manage the farm's accounts, to pay the bills so I wouldn't have to worry. My eyes had been blurred with tears that day, the ink smearing as I scrawled my name. I hadn't read it. I had trusted my son. A fool. I was an old fool. "And if she refuses," Vanessa pressed, her voice sharp with greed. "She won't," Daniel said, a strange mix of bravado and nervousness in his voice. "I'll just tell her it's for a farm improvement loan, something for the spring planting. She'll sign. And if not, well, her signature isn't that hard to copy, is it? We've practiced." The world tilted. The sturdy oak floor beneath my feet felt like shifting sand. I pressed a hand to the wall to steady myself, my breath catching in my throat, a dry, ragged sob I couldn't let escape. Practiced. They had practiced forging my name, the name Robert had given me, the name that was on the deed to this land, this soil we had tilled and nurtured for 45 years. This wasn't just a house, it was our legacy. Every beam in the barn, every fence post in the pasture, Every fruit tree in the orchard was a testament to our life together. We had poured our sweat, our love, and our very souls into this place. And they were talking about it like it was a stack of chips in a casino, a prize to be stolen and cashed in. I heard Vanessa's dismissive sniff. Just get it done. Danny, the creditors are calling daily. Once the farm is in your name, we can leverage it for enough to clear our debts and get that condo in the city. You can sell this dump off piece by piece for all I care. Sell this dump. The words were a physical blow. I thought of the morning light hitting the east pasture, the smell of hay in the barn, the feeling of rich, dark earth crumbling in my hands. This was my sanctuary, my life's work, the place where I still felt Robert's presence in every sunset. And to them, it was a dump, a financial problem to be liquidated. I slid down the wall, sinking into the shadows, the cold of the plaster seeping through my nightgown. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the room grew cold, but a different kind of ice was spreading through my veins. The grief that had been my constant companion for 6 months was suddenly burned away by a white-hot rage. They thought I was a fragile old woman, a good little lamb, half gone and ready for the shearing. They thought my love for my son would blind me to his betrayal. They were about to learn how wrong they were. In the darkness, I made a silent vow. They would not take this farm. They would not erase Robert's memory. I would not be a victim in my own home. My son had started a war. And by God, his mother was going to finish it. The next morning, the sun rose with a cruel cheerfulness, spilling buttery light across the kitchen floor where I stood, making coffee. The familiar motions, scooping the beans, pouring the water, the rich aroma filling the air, were a strange comfort in a world that had become utterly alien overnight. When Daniel and Vanessa walked in, their faces were scrubbed clean of their midnight villainy. They were all smiles and solicitous questions. "Morning, Mom. Sleep well?" Daniel asked, kissing my cheek. The touch felt like a brand. I forced a weak smile, playing the part they had assigned me. "Like a log, dear." I lied, my voice sounding brittle to my own ears. Vanessa was already pouring herself a cup, her movements proprietary, as if she were already the lady of the house. "We were thinking," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "It might be nice to go through your and Dad's old things today, to sort and organize. It must be so overwhelming for you." The suggestion was a thinly veiled reconnaissance mission, a way to assess the value of my life's possessions, but I nodded. "That's a good idea, Vanessa. Thank you." I needed them to believe I was compliant, lost in my grief. I needed to keep them close, to watch their every move. As they went upstairs to the attic, their footsteps echoing above me, I walked out onto the back porch, the cold November air a welcome shock to my system. I looked out over my land. The frost-covered fields stretched out to the line of maple trees at the edge of the property, their branches bare against a pale blue sky. This was my kingdom. Every inch of it held a memory. I walked down the steps and across the yard to the old barn. The massive oak doors groaned as I heaved them open, the scent of old wood, hay, and earth washing over me. This was Robert's domain. His workbench still stood against the far wall, a fine layer of dust covering the tools he had laid out so meticulously. I ran my hand over the smooth, worn surface of the wood, my fingers tracing the nicks and scratches, each one a story. I could see him standing there, a smile on his face, sawdust in his hair. Planning the next project? "It's good land, Maggie," he used to say, his voice full of a quiet, steady pride. "Good, honest land. It'll take care of us if we take care of it." tears I thought had dried up pricked at my eyes. This wasn't just about money for Daniel. It was a desecration. He had grown up here, learned to walk on this grass, learned to drive a tractor in these fields. Had none of it meant anything to him? I wandered deeper into the barn, to the small, dusty office where Robert kept his records. I pulled open a drawer in the old metal filing cabinet. Inside were folders, neatly labeled in his strong, clear handwriting. Cattle, orchard, taxes, year by year. And then I saw it, a thick folder labeled Daniel. My heart clenched. I hadn't looked in it for years. With trembling hands, I lifted it out and sat down on a hay bale, the dusty air catching in the sunbeams, slanting through the high windows. The folder was a painful archive of my son's failures and our desperate, love-fueled attempts to save him. There were the receipts for the tuition for the college he dropped out of, the loan agreement we co-signed for his first failed business, a ridiculous venture involving imported coffee beans, the checks I'd written to cover his rent, his car payments, his credit card bills, each one a small, secret betrayal of the tight budget Robert and I lived on. We had always told ourselves it was a phase, that he was just finding his way. Robert had been harder on him, more clear-eyed. The boy's got a hole in his soul. Maggie, he told me one night, years ago, after another frantic call from Daniel for money. He always wants the easy way out. Life's going to teach him a hard lesson one day. I had defended him then. He's just young. Robert, he'll learn. Now. Robert's words echoed in the cavernous silence of the barn, a prophecy fulfilled. He hadn't learned. He had only gotten worse, and now he had Vanessa to whisper, poison in his ear. The last document in the file was a letter from a lawyer in Boston regarding a debt consolidation. It was dated just 2 months before Daniel and Vanessa had shown up on my doorstep. They were drowning. The farm wasn't just an opportunity for them, it was a lifeline they were willing to steal from a corpse. My corpse. I closed the folder, a cold, hard clarity settling over me. The grief was still there, a dull ache beneath my ribs, but it was no longer a fog. It was a whetstone. And the anger I felt was the steel being sharpened against it. They had misjudged me completely. They saw a grieving widow. They didn't see the woman who had helped Robert build this farm from nothing. The woman who had nursed sick calves through winter storms and stared down bankers during the lean years. They didn't see Robert's wife, but they would. Oh, they would. The days that followed were a masterclass in deception. I moved through my own home like a ghost, a smile fixed on my face, my voice soft and accommodating. I allowed Vanessa to reorganize my kitchen, biting my tongue as she clucked her tongue at my cast iron pans and replaced them with cheap, non-stick monstrosities she'd ordered online. I listened to Daniel's grandiose plans for the farm, his talk of modernizing and maximizing profits, all of which sounded like stripping the land for parts and selling it off. Each word, each condescending pat on my arm, was a log on the fire of my resolve, the turning point. The moment the last of my sorrow burned away and left only cold, hard fury, came on a Tuesday. I was in the living room, dusting the mantelpiece, my fingers lingering on a silver-framed photo of Robert and a much younger Daniel, fishing at Miller's Pond. They were both grinning, holding up a string of trout. The picture of father-son happiness. Vanessa walked in, a steaming mug in her hand. It was Robert's favorite mug, a heavy ceramic one I'd had made for him years ago with a picture of his prize-winning pumpkin on it. He had drunk his morning coffee from it every single day. I had kept it on its specific hook in the cupboard, a small, sacred object. Seeing it in her perfectly manicured hands, her red lipstick already staining the rim, was a violation. You know, "Margaret," she said, her tone light and conversational, "we should really pack away some of these old photos. It can't be healthy to be surrounded by so many reminders." She gestured vaguely at the mantel. My hand tightened on the dust rag. "That was Robert's favorite mug," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. She glanced down at it as if just noticing. "Oh, this old thing, it's a bit chipped, isn't it?" I just grabbed the first one I saw. She took a noisy sip, her eyes meeting mine over the rim. There was a challenge in them, a smug sense of ownership. That was it. That was the final straw. The chip on that mug, the lipstick stain, her casual dismissal of a memory that was precious to me. It was the culmination of every lie, every whisper, every insult. The image of the laughing boy in the photograph blurred as my eyes filled not with tears of grief, but with the searing heat of rage. I said nothing. I simply turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there. I went to my bedroom, closed the door, and stood for a long moment, my breath coming in short. Sharp bursts. The sadness was gone. It had been cauterized, leaving a clean, hard scar in its place. There would be no more tears for the son I had lost, because that boy was well and truly gone, replaced by the stranger downstairs. In his place was a quiet, chilling calm. My mind, once foggy with sorrow, was now razor sharp. I walked to the old secretary desk by the window and pulled out a fresh notebook and a pen. At the top of the first page, I wrote a single word, plan. My hand was perfectly steady. My first call was not to the police. That would be a messy, emotional confrontation, his word against mine. No, this had to be precise, clinical. I needed proof. I needed a professional. My mind sifted through the faces of old friends, people I could trust, and then a name surfaced. Sarah Jenkins, a dear friend from my college days, now a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer in Burlington who specialized in estate law and fraud. We hadn't spoken in years, but Sarah was fiercely loyal and had a mind like a steel trap. I found her number in my old address book. My heart hammered against my ribs as I dialed, not from fear, but from a kind of terrible excitement. This was the first move in a game Daniel didn't even know we were playing. She answered on the third ring, her voice as crisp and direct as I remembered. "Sarah Jenkins." "Sarah," I said, my voice low. "It's Margaret Hayes, Margaret Bishop, from UVM." There was a moment of silence, and then a warm laugh. "Maggie, my God, it's been ages. How are you? I was so sorry to hear about Robert." "I'm managing," I said. "Listen, Sarah, I'm in a bit of trouble. The kind of trouble I think you're uniquely qualified to handle. Can I come see you? It has to be completely confidential. No one can know." The warmth in her voice was immediately replaced by professional concern. "Of course. Maggie, my office. Tomorrow at 10. Use the back entrance. Is everything all right?" "No, Sarah," I said, looking out the window at my son, who was pacing in the yard, talking animatedly on his cell phone, probably to one of his creditors. "Nothing is all right, but it's going to be—" I hung up the phone. The war had begun. The grieving widow was gone. In her place stood a woman with nothing left to lose and a farm to save. The next morning, I told Daniel and Vanessa I was going into town to meet with my garden club, a lie that slid off my tongue with unnerving ease. The feigned helplessness I had perfected over the past few weeks was my greatest weapon. "Oh, don't you worry about a thing, Mom," Daniel said, patting my shoulder. "You go have fun with your little flower friends. We'll hold down the fort." His condescension was so thick I could have scraped it off with a trowel. I just smiled my frail, sad smile and let him help me with my coat. a coat that smelled faintly of Robert's old pipe tobacco, a scent I clung to for strength. The drive to Burlington was a blur of autumn colors that I barely registered. My mind was a machine, turning over the details of the past few weeks, cataloging every suspicious word, every dismissive gesture. Sarah's office was in a restored brick building downtown, as instructed. I went around to the back alley and used the discreet rear entrance. She was waiting for me. Her office warm and smelling of old books and strong coffee. Sarah hadn't changed much. Her hair was grayer, but her eyes were still the same. Sharp, intelligent, and missing nothing. We dispensed with the pleasantries quickly. I sat across from her large mahogany desk, and for the next hour, I laid out the whole ugly story, from the whispers on the stairs to the forged signature they'd practiced. I spoke in a low, steady voice, devoid of the tears and hysterics they expected of me. I presented the facts as if I were describing a problem with a piece of farm equipment. When I finished, Sarah was silent for a long moment, her fingers steepled under her chin. Her expression was grim. "The vipers," she said, her voice a low growl. "They moved into your home to fleece you while you were grieving. Maggie, this is more than just a family dispute. This is elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy." The clinical terms gave a strange, validating weight to my pain. "What do I do, Sarah?" I asked. "I can't just throw them out. They'll get suspicious, and it's my word against theirs about the forgery." "You're right," she said, leaning forward. "We don't move until we have them dead to rights. From this moment on, you are an intelligence agent in your own home. Your weakness is your camouflage. You will continue to be the grieving, slightly confused mother. You will listen, you will watch, and you will document everything." She slid a legal pad and a pen across the desk to me. "Every conversation, every phone call you overhear, every time they pressure you to sign something, write down the date, the time, what was said. Details are everything." She then swiveled in her chair and pointed to a small, sleek device on her credenza. "This is a digital voice recorder. It's no bigger than your thumb. Keep it in your apron pocket. If you're in a room with them and they start talking business, click it on." Vermont is a one-party consent state, which means as long as you are part of the conversation or in the room where it's happening, you can legally record it. She handed it to me. It felt cold and heavy in my palm, a small piece of metal that held the power to either save me or expose me. "The power of attorney you signed is a problem," she continued, her tone serious. "He could, in theory, use it to make financial decisions without you. But transferring the deed or taking out a new mortgage is a major transaction. He would need a very cooperative or very sloppy lawyer to push that through without speaking to you directly. We need to find out who he's using." "What about the farm?" I asked, the fear a cold knot in my stomach. "Can he sell it out from under me?" "Not yet," Sarah said, her confidence a balm to my frayed nerves. "I'm going to place a quiet lien watch on your property title. If anyone, Daniel, his lawyer, a bank, makes an inquiry or tries to file any new paperwork against your deed, I'll be alerted instantly. He's planning a quiet, sneaky transfer. We'll make sure there's a tripwire he can't see." I left her office an hour later, feeling transformed. The fear and rage were still there, but now they were channeled, focused. I was no longer just a victim. I was a strategist. I had a mission. When I got home, I found Daniel and Vanessa in the kitchen, looking at glossy brochures for luxury condos. They snapped them shut when I walked in, guilt flashing across their faces before being replaced by their usual saccharine smiles. "How are the flowers, Mom?" Vanessa asked. "Lovely, dear," I said. patting my pocket where the small recorder now rested. We talked about pest control for the roses. I went about making tea, my movement slow and deliberate, the perfect picture of an elderly woman winding down her day. But inside, I was anything but. I was a hunter, and my prey was right in front of me, fattening themselves on my inheritance, completely unaware that the trap was being set. The war was silent, but it was being waged with every documented lie, every secret recording, every step I took that they couldn't see. The weeks that followed were a quiet, nerve-wracking hell. I lived a dual life on the surface. I was Margaret Hayes, grieving widow, a woman fading into the background of her own life. I'd forget where I put my glasses. I'd ask Daniel to repeat himself, feigning a hearing loss that didn't exist. I played my part so well that I sometimes feared I might actually become the person I was pretending to be. But beneath the surface, I was a spy. The little notebook Sarah had given me became my Bible, filled with notations in a cramped, tiny script. 9/12/2:15 p.m. Daniel on phone in barn. Mentioned fast-tracking the appraisal and the old woman won't know the difference. 9/14, 8 p.m. V. Complained about having to humor me. Said once, the papers are signed. They'll put me in the nicest home they can afford. The digital recorder in my apron pocket became an extension of my own memory, capturing the venomous whispers that filled the air whenever they thought I was out of earshot. As November bled into the bleakness of December, their impatience began to fray the edges of their careful facade. The condescending sweetness started to curdle into open irritation. The mask was slipping. It started with small things. One afternoon, I came back from a walk to find that a crew of men was in the east pasture, taking down a section of the old stone wall Robert and I had spent an entire summer building by hand. Daniel was directing them, a look of smug authority on his face. "What is this?" "Daniel," I asked, my voice trembling with a rage I had to fight to conceal. "Just making some improvements." "Mom," he said dismissively, not even looking at me. "This old wall is crumbling. We're clearing it out to make a better access road for equipment." "Your father built that wall," I said, the words feeling like stones in my throat. He finally turned to me, his eyes cold. "Dad's gone. Mom, we have to think about the future, about efficiency. You can't be sentimental about every rock and tree." He turned his back on me then, shouting an order to the work crew. I stood there, watching them dismantle my past, and understood that he wasn't just clearing a field, he was erasing my husband. He was erasing me. Vanessa grew bolder, too. She began redecorating the house with a ruthless efficiency, packing away my cherished belongings into boxes labeled "Donate." She replaced my warm, handmade quilts with cold, modern duvets. She took down Robert's landscape paintings and hung abstract art that looked like angry splashes of color. The house began to feel less and less like my own. It was becoming a sterile, impersonal space that reflected her tastes, not the life that had been lived within its walls. The final, ugliest confrontation came over the Christmas decorations. It was a tradition Robert and I had cherished. Every year, the first weekend of December, we'd bring the boxes down from the attic. I had a collection of handmade ornaments, each one holding a memory. I walked into the living room one morning to find Vanessa on a stepladder, hanging sleek, silver bulbs on the tree. The box of my old ornaments was sitting on the floor, untouched. "What are you doing?" I asked. She glanced down, a flash of annoyance on her face. "Just getting the tree done. Margaret, I bought these new ones. They're much more cohesive." "Where are my ornaments?" "Oh, those dusty old things. They're in the box. Honestly, they're a bit shabby. It's time for a fresh start, don't you think? Her tone was final, dismissive. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a decree. The sight of my memories, my life's collection of small joys, being called shabby and cast aside by this intruder, broke something in me. "This is my house," I said, my voice low and shaking. "Those are my memories. You will take those silver balls down, and you will get out of my home." The silence that followed was electric. Vanessa's face hardened, the fake sweetness dissolving to reveal the pure, ugly contempt beneath. Daniel, hearing our raised voices, rushed in from the kitchen. "What's going on? Your mother is being hysterical," Vanessa snapped. "Over a few Christmas ornaments." Daniel looked at me, his face a mask of exasperation. "Mom, for God's sake, calm down. Vanessa is just trying to help. We're trying to make things nice for you." "By throwing my life in a box?" I shot back, my voice rising. "By tearing down the walls your father built? This isn't help. Daniel, this is a hostile takeover." The words hung in the air. I had said too much. I saw the flash of panic in his eyes, quickly replaced by a cold fury. "You're overwrought," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "You're not thinking clearly. Maybe Vanessa is right. Maybe all these reminders are just confusing you." He took a step toward me, his expression one I had never seen before. It was the look of a zookeeper cornering a troublesome animal. "We're just trying to take care of you. Mom. Now, why don't you go upstairs and rest? We'll handle this." It wasn't a request. It was an order. I backed away, my heart pounding. The mask wasn't just slipping anymore, it was gone. I was no longer a mother in their eyes. I was an obstacle. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that they were running out of patience. They would make their move soon. I just had to be ready for it. After the confrontation over the Christmas ornaments, a suffocating quiet fell over the house. Daniel and Vanessa moved around me with a strained, artificial politeness that was more menacing than their open hostility. They were waiting. I was waiting. The tension was a constant, humming wire stretched between us. I knew I needed the final piece of the puzzle. Sarah had warned me that the power of attorney was their key, but the mortgage application was the weapon. I needed the physical proof of their intent to commit fraud. I just didn't know where they were keeping it. My chance came on a frigid Thursday afternoon. A snowstorm was brewing, the sky a heavy, bruised purple. Daniel announced that he and Vanessa had to drive into Burlington for a meeting with a financial planner, a lie so transparent it was almost insulting. "The roads are going to be bad, Mom," he said, zipping his expensive jacket. "You just stay put, keep the fire going. We'll be back before it gets too thick." I nodded meekly, watching them from the window as their car fishtailed slightly on the icy driveway before disappearing down the road. The moment they were gone, I moved. The house was mine again, if only for a few hours. I didn't know where to start. Their bedroom was the obvious place, but it felt too risky, too personal. I decided to start in the small study off the living room, the room Daniel had claimed as his office. It was Robert's old room, where he used to tie flies for fishing and read farming almanacs. Now it was cluttered with Daniel's laptop, piles of mail, and the lingering scent of Vanessa's cloying perfume. I started with the desk drawers. They were a mess of unpaid bills, letters from collection agencies, and takeout menus. The sheer scale of their debt was staggering. They were desperate. I moved to the closet, sifting through pockets of coats, finding nothing but lint and old receipts. My frustration grew with every empty search. Had I been wrong? Was the paperwork with their lawyer? I was about to give up when my eyes landed on an old, leather-bound briefcase tucked under the desk. It wasn't Daniel's, it was Robert's. I recognized the scuffed corners and the worn brass latches. Why would Daniel be using his father's old briefcase? My fingers trembled as I pulled it out. It wasn't locked. I held my breath and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled amongst some of Daniel's own files, was a thick manila folder. It had no label. My heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I lifted the folder out and opened it on the desk. The top document was a preliminary title report for my farm. Beneath it was a property appraisal, one that valued the land at a shockingly low number, clearly arranged to minimize tax implications for a quick sale. And then, at the very bottom, I found it. It was a multi-page mortgage application from a lending institution I'd never heard of, a company that likely specialized in high-risk, high-interest loans. The borrower's name was listed as Daniel Hayes, and the collateral was my farm. I flipped through the pages, my vision blurring, and then I saw the last page, the signature page. There, at the bottom, was a series of clumsy, hesitant scrawls in blue ink on a separate sheet of paper. They were practicing my name, Margaret Hayes. Margaret Hayes. And below their pathetic attempts was a clean copy of the signature page, with my name forged on the line, a nearly perfect but soulless imitation. A wave of nausea washed over me. Seeing it, the cold, hard proof of their calculated betrayal, was so much worse than just hearing them talk about it. This was real. This was the instrument of my destruction, the key that would lock me out of my own life. They hadn't even waited for me to refuse. They had the forgery ready to go. I took out my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely operate it. I laid the documents out on the desk, the practice sheet next to the forged signature, and took several clear, well-lit photographs. I sent them to Sarah with a one-word message. Proof. Her reply came almost instantly. Stay calm. Do not confront them. I'm calling the sheriff's department. We're coming. I carefully put everything back in the folder, placed it in the briefcase, and slid it back under the desk, exactly where I had found it. I walked out of the study and closed the door, my movements calm and deliberate. I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on as if it were any other day. The snow had started to fall, thick, heavy flakes that muffled the world in a blanket of white. It was quiet, the kind of profound quiet that comes before a storm breaks. And I knew, as I stood there watching the snow pile up against the window panes, that this was the last quiet moment. When that car came back up the driveway, my old life would be over and a new, uncertain one would begin. The wait was the longest hour of my life. The kettle whistled, and I made myself a cup of tea, my hands cupped around the warm ceramic for comfort. The snow was coming down harder now, a true Vermont blizzard, and a small, treacherous part of me worried about Daniel and Vanessa on the roads. It was a foolish, vestigial twitch of maternal instinct, a ghost of a love that was now dead and buried. I sat in my armchair by the fire, the notebook and the small recorder nestled in my lap under an Afghan. I watched the clock on the mantel. Tick, tock. Each sound was a drumbeat marching toward the inevitable confrontation. Just as the dusk began to settle, casting the room in a deep blue gloom, I saw the headlights. They cut through the thick, swirling snow, two bright beams approaching the house. My heart leaped into my throat. A moment later, a second set of headlights appeared behind them, a larger vehicle. The county sheriff. Sarah had done it. They had arrived at the same time. I rose from my chair, my legs feeling surprisingly steady, and walked to the front door. I flicked on the porch light just as Daniel's car slid to a stop. The sheriff's SUV pulled in right behind them, blocking their exit. Daniel and Vanessa got out of their car, their faces etched with annoyance at the storm. They didn't see the official vehicle at first. "God, what a drive," Vanessa complained, pulling her thin coat tighter. "I need a drink." "The lights are on in the barn. Mom," Daniel called out, his voice sharp with irritation. "Did you leave them on all day?" And then he saw him, Sheriff Brody, a big old stoic man I'd known since he was a boy, was stepping out of his truck, his hat pulled low against the snow. Sarah got out of the passenger side, her expression grim and resolute. The color drained from Daniel's face. Vanessa froze, one hand on the car door, her eyes darting from me to the sheriff and back again. The practiced smiles were gone, replaced by raw, naked panic. "Margaret," Sheriff Brody said, his voice a calm, deep rumble as he trudged through the snow to the porch. "Sarah here called me, said there was a situation that needed my attention." "Sheriff," Daniel said, forcing a laugh that sounded like a strangled cough. "What's all this? Is something wrong?" "That's what I'm here to find out," Brody said, his eyes fixed on my son. "Daniel, your mother has made some very serious allegations." Vanessa found her voice first, a high-pitched, incredulous shriek. "Allegations? What is she talking about? She's confused. Sheriff, she's been unwell since her husband passed, not thinking clearly." I looked at her, at this woman who had eaten at my table and slept in my house while plotting to steal it all. I felt nothing but a cold, clean contempt. I stepped forward, past the sheriff, and looked my son directly in the eye. "I heard you, Daniel," I said, my voice clear and strong, carrying over the howling wind. "On the stairs, I heard everything. I heard you talk about forging my name. I heard you call this house a dump. I heard you plan to take everything my father and I ever built." Daniel's face was a mess of emotions, shock, fear, and a flash of pure, childish outrage at being caught. That's ridiculous. You're twisting things. We were just trying to help you manage your finances." Sarah stepped forward, holding a folder. "Is that why you have a forged mortgage application in your father's briefcase?" "Daniel?" she asked, her voice cutting through the storm. "An application that would have transferred ownership of this entire property to you, so you could leverage it to pay off your creditors in Boston?" Vanessa let out a small, strangled gasp. Daniel stared at Sarah, then at me, and in his eyes I saw the final desperate gamble of a cornered rat. He was going to deny, to lie, to paint me as a senile, vindictive old woman. But I was ready. I held up the small digital recorder. "It's all here, Daniel," I said quietly. "Every word, every lie." The fight went out of him then. His shoulders slumped, the manufactured bravado collapsing like a house of cards. He looked small and pathetic, a 40-year-old child caught with his hand in the cookie jar, the snow clinging to his expensive coat. Sheriff Brody stepped between us. "Daniel Hayes, Vanessa Hayes," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I need you to come with me. We have some questions for you down at the station." The finality of it was absolute. As Brody led them to his vehicle, their faces pale and stunned in the flashing blue and red lights, Daniel looked back at me one last time. There was no remorse in his eyes, only a raw, bottomless hatred, the hatred of a thief for the person who had caught them. I stood on the porch, the wind whipping snow around me, and watched the taillights of the sheriff's SUV disappear down the long driveway, leaving only a single set of tracks in the freshly fallen snow. The house behind me was silent. It was empty. And for the first time in months, it was mine again. The confrontation in the snowstorm was not an ending. It was the beginning of a long, cold war, fought not in whispers and shadows, but in the sterile, fluorescent lit world of the justice system. The immediate aftermath was a deafening silence. The house, which had felt so crowded and suffocating with Daniel and Vanessa's presence, now seemed vast and empty. Every creaking floorboard, every sigh of the wind against the eaves, echoed with the ghosts of what had happened. I spent the first few days in a daze, cleaning. I scrubbed away every trace of them. I packed up the cold, modern things Vanessa had bought and took them to the donation center. I carefully unwrapped my old Christmas ornaments and hung them on the tree, their familiar, shabby shapes a comfort in the lonely rooms. I reclaimed my house, inch by painful inch, but the legal battle cast a long shadow over my reclaimed peace. Daniel and Vanessa were charged with fraud, forgery, and attempted grand larceny. They were released on bail, paid for by Vanessa's parents, and the long, slow process of depositions and court dates began. Sarah was my rock. She guided me through the labyrinth of legal procedures, her calm competence a shield against the ugliness of it all. I had to give a formal statement, recounting the entire story to a detective, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. I had to sit in a small, airless room while their lawyer, a slick man with a predatory smile, questioned me for hours during a deposition. He tried to paint me as a confused, grieving woman, easily manipulated, perhaps even senile. He brought up my age, my recent widowhood, every vulnerability he could find, and tried to twist it into a weapon against me. Mrs. Hayes, isn't it possible you misunderstood what your son was saying? He'd ask, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Isn't it true that you were feeling overwhelmed by the farm's finances and Daniel was simply trying to help? Each question was a fresh stab, a new attempt to invalidate my reality. But the anger that had been forged in those first few weeks had hardened into something unbreakable. I met his gaze without flinching. I held on to the truth. My son called me a good little lamb and planned to steal my home, I would reply, my voice steady. There is no misunderstanding that. The town, once a source of comfort, became a minefield of whispers and sideways glances. News travels fast in a small Vermont community. Some people were supportive, offering a kind word at the general store or a sympathetic nod at the post office, but others looked at me with pity or, worse, suspicion. I was the woman whose own son had tried to rob her. A family shame, aired out for all to see. I felt the isolation keenly. The friends I had in the garden club were kind, but they couldn't understand the depth of the betrayal. How do you explain the specific pain of having the child you raised, the child you loved more than life itself, look you in the eye and see nothing more than a bank account to be emptied? There were nights I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, and the rage would subside, leaving behind a raw, aching grief. It was a grief not for the man who was being prosecuted, but for the little boy in the photograph on my mantel, the boy who had held up a string of trout with a gap-toothed grin. Where did he go? When did the rot set in? Was it something I did? Something I failed to do? These were the questions that haunted the long, quiet hours of the night. It was a lonely vigil, processing the death of my son, even though he was still alive. The legal process was a necessary poison, the only way to save the farm, but it was forcing me to excise a part of my own heart, and the wound it left was gaping and raw. The day of the verdict arrived on a crisp, clear day in late spring. The snow had long since melted, and the first green shoots were pushing their way through the dark, damp earth in my fields. It felt like the whole world was waking up, while my life had been frozen in a state of suspended animation for months. I sat in the front row of the courtroom, Sarah beside me. I hadn't seen Daniel or Vanessa since the preliminary hearings. They sat at the defendant's table, looking pale and diminished in their cheap suits. Daniel wouldn't look at me. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, a muscle twitching in his cheek. Vanessa seemed to have shrunk, all her sharp, brittle confidence gone, leaving only a pinched, fearful expression. The trial itself had been a blur of testimonies and evidence. The prosecutor had methodically laid out the case, the secret recordings, the financial documents from the folder. The expert testimony confirming the signature on the mortgage application was a forgery. The most damning evidence was the recording of their conversation on the stairs. Hearing their voices, stripped of all pretense, echo through the silent courtroom was a surreal and sickening experience. Their defense was weak, pathetic. Their lawyer tried to argue it was all a terrible misunderstanding, that Daniel was just exploring financial options to help his aging mother. They tried to portray me as vindictive and confused, but the evidence was too overwhelming. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. When they filed back into the jury box, their faces were solemn, unreadable. The court clerk took the verdict slip from the foreman. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the overhead lights. On the charge of conspiracy to commit grand larceny, the clerk read, her voice flat and emotionless. How do you find the defendant, Daniel Hayes? The foreman, a stern-faced dairy farmer I vaguely recognized, stood up, guilty. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Vanessa let out a sob. On the charge of forgery. Guilty. On the charge of attempted fraud. Guilty. The words rained down, each one a hammer blow, not of victory, but of a terrible, grim finality. The same verdicts were read for Vanessa. Guilty on all counts. The judge, a woman with a severe face and compassionate eyes, looked down at Daniel and Vanessa. She spoke of the sanctity of trust, especially between a child and a parent. She spoke of their greed and the callous way they had preyed upon their own family in a time of grief. Daniel was sentenced to 5 years in state prison, with a possibility of parole after 3. Vanessa received a lesser sentence of 18 months, plus probation. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. I felt nothing, not triumph, not satisfaction, just a profound, hollow emptiness. This was what justice looked like. It was ugly and sad and broke your heart. As the bailiffs led Daniel away in handcuffs and head bowed, our eyes finally met. For a single, fleeting moment, I saw the little boy again, his eyes wide with fear, and my breath caught in my chest. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold, hard glare of a stranger. Later that afternoon, Sarah and I sat in her office. The sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She slid a thick document across the desk to me. "It's done, Maggie," she said gently. "The power of attorney has been revoked. The title is clear. The farm is yours, unequivocally." I picked up the deed. My name, Margaret Hayes, was typed in stark black ink. The paper felt heavy in my hands, heavier than it should. It was more than a deed to a piece of land. It was a testament to my survival. It was the closing of the most painful chapter of my life. I looked out the window at the bustling street below. People were going about their lives, laughing, talking, completely unaware of the battles won and lost in the quiet rooms above them. I had won. I had saved the farm. But I had lost my son. The cost of this victory was a price I would carry with me for the rest of my days. Holding the deed to my chest, I finally allowed myself to weep, not for the son who went to prison, but for the one I would never see again. The farm was quiet in the months that followed. The legal battle was over. The whispers in town had faded, and the silence Daniel and Vanessa left behind was no longer an emptiness, but a clean, open space. The rhythms of the land took over again, the planting, the weeding, the patient waiting for things to grow. But I had changed. The grief and rage had carved something new in me, a strength I didn't know I possessed, but also a deep, abiding understanding of what it felt like to be vulnerable, to have your safe world shattered by the people you should have been able to trust the most. The idea came to me one evening in early autumn as I sat on the back porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. I had all this space, this beautiful healing land, and I was just one woman. A local news story had been bothering me all week, a brief report about a nearby women's shelter that was full to overflowing, having to turn people away. I thought of the terror and helplessness I had felt, cornered in my own home. I thought of how lucky I had been to have the resources and the strength to fight back. What about the women who didn't? The next day, I called Sarah. "I have an idea," I said, "and you're probably going to tell me it's crazy." I laid out my plan to turn the farm, my home, into a sanctuary. A place where women escaping domestic abuse could come, not just for a bed to sleep in, but for a place to heal. A place where they could put their hands in the earth and feel something grow. A place to breathe clean air and find their strength again. It wouldn't be a shelter in the traditional sense, but a working farm, a community, a safe haven. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "It's not crazy, Maggie," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's the most perfect, beautiful thing I've ever heard." With Sarah's legal help, we established a nonprofit foundation. I used a portion of the farm's savings, the money Daniel had been so desperate to get his hands on, to convert the old guest house and parts of the main farmhouse into simple, comfortable living quarters. We called it Safe Haven Acres. The first woman to arrive was named Clara. She was young, barely 30, with a bruised face and eyes that held the haunted look of a frightened animal. She didn't speak much for the first week. She just followed me around the farm, watching me work, a silent shadow. One morning, I was in the vegetable garden, thinning out the carrot seedlings. I held out a handful of the tiny, discarded plants. "Here," I said gently. "You can do this, Rao." She hesitated, then knelt in the dirt beside me. Her hands, I noticed, were shaking. But she began to work, her fingers clumsy at first, then more sure, carefully teasing the delicate seedlings from the soil. We worked in silence for a long time, the only sounds the twitter of birds and the soft rustle of leaves. "My husband," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "He told me I was useless, that I couldn't do anything right." I stopped my work and looked at her. "Look what you're doing now," I said. "You're helping to bring food from the earth. There's nothing more useful than that." A single tear rolled down her cheek and fell onto the dark soil. It was the first of many small breakthroughs. A few weeks later, 2 more women arrived. Maria, a mother of a toddler, and Eleanor, a woman my age who had endured 40 years of a quiet, soul-crushing marriage. Our little community began to take shape. We worked together in the fields. We cooked together in my large kitchen. We ate together at the long wooden table Robert had built. We shared stories. We shared tears. We shared the quiet, healing power of the land. This morning, I woke before dawn. I walked out to the east pasture, the one where Daniel had tried to tear down the stone wall. The wall was still gone, but in its place, something new was taking root. Clara, Maria, and Eleanor were already there, their silhouettes dark against the first pale light of dawn. Together, we were planting a new row of apple trees. I handed a young sapling to Clara. She took it and knelt, placing it gently into the hole we had dug. As she began to push the rich soil around its roots, a real smile, the first I had ever seen from her, lit up her face. Watching them, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, deeper and more profound than any I had ever known. The farm had been my past, my legacy with Robert. It had almost been the source of my destruction. But now, it was something more. It was a future. It was a place of new beginnings, not just for me, but for all of us. As the sun broke over the horizon, bathing the fields in a warm, golden light, I knew I had finally found my purpose. The seeds of a new life, sown in the soil of old sorrows, were beginning to grow. The sun climbs higher now, warming my face. From the porch, I can see the new apple saplings, their leaves catching the morning light. Each one is a testament to resilience. This farm, once a place of deep personal history and bitter betrayal, now hums with a new kind of energy. It's the quiet hum of healing, the soft laughter from the kitchen, the determined work in the fields. It's the sound of women rebuilding their lives, not on the ashes of their past, but in the fertile ground of a shared future. My son's crime was an attempt to erase a legacy, to turn a lifetime of love and labor into nothing more than cash to pay off his debts. But what he failed to understand is that the true value of this land was never in its price per acre. Its value is in its ability to nurture, to sustain, and now, to heal. He tried to take my home, and in doing so, he helped me discover its true purpose. Safe Haven Acres is my final harvest, a legacy I am building not just in memory of Robert, but for all the women who will come here seeking refuge and finding strength. What does the idea of home mean to you after hearing this story? Have you ever had to find the strength to completely redefine your life after a great loss or betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories give strength to others. If this story touched you, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice and new beginnings.